Right now, as you're listening to this, sea levels are exactly where they're supposed to be. Coastlines sit where we expect them. The distance between continents feels fixed, permanent, like it's always been this way. But 12,000 years ago, if you could have looked down at Earth from space, you wouldn't have recognized it. It would have looked like an alien planet. Ice sheets 2 miles thick covered North America all the way down to where New York City is today. Europe was buried under glaciers stretching from Scandinavia to Germany. Asia, South America, massive portions of every continent locked under billions of tons of frozen water. The ice was so heavy it literally pressed the continents down, deforming the Earth's crust beneath its weight, and it had been this way for over 100,000 years. Then something happened, something that would transform the entire planet in just a few thousand years. The ice began to melt, not slowly, not gradually, catastrophically. What followed was the most dramatic transformation Earth had experienced since the extinction of the dinosaurs. Sea levels rose over 400 feet. Entire subcontinents disappeared beneath the waves. Massive floods carved new landscapes. Climate patterns shifted violently, and countless species, animals that had survived for millions of years, suddenly vanished forever. Giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, woolly mammoths, dire wolves, all gone within a geological eye blink. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. So maybe subscribe and tell me where you are and what time it is. I read the comments and it's wild. Tokyo at dawn, Texas at midnight, London at lunch. All trying to drift off to the same story. Here's what makes this period so fascinating and so mysterious. We know the Ice Age ended. Obviously, right? We're not living under mile-thick glaciers, but what triggered it? What turned Earth from a frozen wasteland into the world we know today? And why did it happen so fast? Scientists have been piecing together this puzzle for decades, drilling ice cores in Antarctica, analyzing sediment layers at the bottom of oceans, studying cave formations and ancient pollen trapped in rock. And what they've discovered is way more dramatic than anyone imagined. The end of the Ice Age wasn't a gentle warming, like turning up a thermostat. It was chaos. Sudden temperature spikes followed by equally sudden freezing periods. Meltwater floods so enormous they make modern tsunamis look like ripples in a bathtub. Sea level rises so rapid that human lifespans would have witnessed entire coastlines disappear. Imagine being a human 12,000 years ago. Your ancestors had lived in the same region for thousands of years. They knew every hunting ground, every water source, every shelter. Then, within a single lifetime, everything changes. The lands you hunted on are flooding. The animals you depended on are dying out. The climate is becoming unpredictable, violent. You have to move to adapt or die. And here's the really mind-blowing part. This period, this moment of catastrophic transformation, this is when human civilization as we know it began, not despite the chaos, but because of it. The end of the Ice Age forced humans to develop agriculture, to build permanent settlements, to create new technologies. Everything that defines modern human society, cities, farming, writing, complex social structures, all of it emerged in the aftermath of the Great Melt. This is the story of the most dramatic climate change event in human history. Not something that might happen in our future, but something that already happened, something we survived, something that made us who we are. We're going to explore what the world looked like when it was frozen, what triggered the Great Thaw, and what happened when billions of tons of ice turned to water and flooded across the planet. We'll discover lost lands swallowed by rising seas, encounter extinct giants that walked the earth just 12,000 years ago, and follow human populations as they adapted to a world transforming before their eyes. The Ice Age didn't just end, it exploded, and we're still living in the world it created. To understand what happened when the Ice Ages ended, you first need to understand just how different the world was when they were at their peak. And I mean radically different. Not just colder, not just icier, but a fundamentally alien planet that would be barely recognizable if you could somehow travel back and see it. We're talking about the last glacial maximum. The LGM to scientists who study it obsessively. The period between roughly 26,500 and 19,000 years ago, when the ice reached its absolute maximum extent, when the glaciers that had been growing for tens of thousands of years finally hit their peak. Picture this. You're standing where Chicago is today, but there's no Chicago. There's no Lake Michigan. There's no prairie, no forest, no farms. There's just ice. A wall of ice so tall you can't see the top. 2 miles thick. That's not a typo. 2 miles, 10,560 feet of solid glacial ice stacked on top of what would one day become the American Midwest. The Laurentide ice sheet, as geologists call it, covered essentially all of Canada and extended down into what's now the northern United States. From the Atlantic to the Rocky Mountains, from the Arctic Ocean to roughly where modern-day New York, Chicago and Seattle sit today. Just ice. Endless, crushing, miles-thick ice. And that was just North America. Europe had its own ice sheet. The Fennoscandian ice sheet blanketed Scandinavia, covered the Baltic Sea, extended into northern Germany and Poland, and reached across into Russia. Britain wasn't an island. It was the western edge of a frozen European landmass, connected to the continent by hundreds of miles of exposed seafloor that we now call Doggerland. Asia had multiple ice complexes, the Barents Kara ice sheet in northern Russia, glaciers throughout Siberia. The Tibetan plateau was buried under ice. Even in the southern hemisphere, ice sheets in Patagonia and Antarctica were vastly larger than they are today. All told, ice sheets covered about 30% of Earth's land surface during the LGM. Today, they cover about 10%. That's a staggering difference, an entire extra continent's worth of ice, just sitting there, locking up water that would normally be in the oceans. Which brings us to one of the most mind-bending aspects of the glacial maximum, the sea level. During the LGM, global sea levels were approximately 400 feet lower than they are today. 400 feet. Think about that for a moment. That's a 40-story building. That's the entire depth of most continental shelves. All that water was locked up in the ice sheets. It had evaporated from the oceans over tens of thousands of years, fallen as snow on the growing glaciers, and just stayed there, compressed into ice, piling up mile after mile, year after year, century after century. The oceans were being drained to feed the ice, and when sea levels drop 400 feet, land masses appear. Vast territories that are underwater today were above sea level during the LGM. The Bering Strait, that narrow gap between Alaska and Russia, didn't exist. Instead, there was Beringia, a subcontinent roughly the size of Texas, stretching from Siberia to Alaska and beyond. Not a narrow land bridge as it's sometimes depicted, but a vast open landscape with its own ecosystems, its own weather patterns, its own populations of animals and humans. Doggerland, that drowned land between Britain and Europe, was a massive plain during the LGM. Rivers flowed across it, animals migrated through it, people lived there, hunted there, built shelters and raised families in what's now 100 feet of North Sea water. Southeast Asia was completely different. The islands of Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, They were all connected to the Asian mainland or to each other by exposed seafloor. What we call the South China Sea was largely dry land. The Persian Gulf didn't exist as a body of water, it was a river valley. The coastlines of every continent extended miles, sometimes hundreds of miles beyond their current positions, and these weren't barren wastelands. These exposed continental shelves were prime real estate, river valleys, coastal plains, areas where marine nutrients met terrestrial ecosystems. These were some of the most productive environments on the planet, and they're all underwater now, which means the archaeological record of human life during the LGM is mostly drowned and destroyed. But the low sea levels and massive ice sheets were just the beginning of how different the world was. The climate patterns were completely transformed. The jet streams, those rivers of air that drive weather systems across the planet, were pushed far to the south by the massive ice sheets. This created climate zones that have no modern equivalent. Much of what's now temperate North America was a polar desert, cold, dry, windswept. Not exactly like Antarctica, but closer to that than to anything you'd see in North America today. The Mammoth Steppe, as paleontologists call it, stretched from Spain across Europe and Asia to Alaska and the Yukon. A vast grassland ecosystem unlike anything that exists today, maintained by the peculiar conditions of the glacial climate. Cold and dry, but with enough summer sun to support massive herds of grazing animals. Tropical regions were dramatically smaller and drier. The Amazon rainforest, that vast expanse of jungle that today covers an area roughly the size of the continental United States, was fragmented during the LGM, reduced to isolated pockets of forest surrounded by savanna and grassland. The Congo Basin in Africa experienced similar contraction. The tropical belt, which today extends roughly 3,000 miles north and south of the equator, was compressed into a fraction of that range. Deserts expanded. The Sahara, which today is the world's largest hot desert, was even more extreme during the LGM. It extended farther south and was more arid than at any point in recent geological history. The Australian interior was even drier than it is now. Deserts in Central Asia expanded to cover areas that today receive enough rainfall to support grasslands. But here's what's really wild. Some areas that are now marginal were actually better during the glacial maximum. Regions of North Africa that are desert today had reliable water sources. The Mediterranean Sea was smaller, and rivers that are now intermittent flowed year-round. Parts of the Middle East that are arid today supported substantial vegetation. The climate was more seasonal everywhere. Summers were shorter but intense. Winters were longer and more brutal. The temperature difference between summer and winter in any given location was more extreme than today. This created unique challenges and opportunities for any organism trying to survive, and survive they did. The megafauna of the last ice age were the most spectacular assemblage of large animals Earth had seen since the age of dinosaurs. Woolly mammoths, standing 11 feet at the shoulder, covered in thick fur with curved tusks up to 16 feet long, roamed across the mammoth steppe in vast herds. Their slightly smaller cousins, the woolly rhinoceros, browsed alongside them. In North America, mastodons occupied the forested regions south of the ice sheets. Giant ground sloths, some as tall as 20 feet when standing upright, browsed on tree leaves. Glyptodonts, basically armadillo-like creatures the size of small cars, wandered the grasslands. Saber-toothed cats, including the famous Smilodon with its 7-inch fangs, ambushed prey at waterholes and kill sites. Short-faced bears, the largest carnivorous land. Mammals that have ever existed stood 12 feet tall on their hind legs and may have weighed up to 2,000 pounds. They were fast too, possibly capable of outrunning horses. Giant beavers, as large as modern black bears, built dams and lodges in the ice-marginal lakes and rivers. In Europe and Asia, cave bears, cave lions, and cave hyenas competed with early humans for shelter and resources. Giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet from tip to tip roamed the forests. Steppe bison, larger and more robust than modern bison, formed the base of the food chain across the grasslands. These weren't relict populations clinging to existence, they were thriving. The mammoth steppe supported animal biomass densities that rivaled or exceeded those of modern African savannas. Herds of thousands of animals migrating across continental distances, predator populations that would seem impossible today. And living among these giants were humans, not many of them. The total global human population during the LGM was probably somewhere between 1 and 10 million individuals. For comparison, that's roughly the population of modern New York City, spread across the entire planet. We were rare, scattered, living in small groups in the few places that could sustain us. But we were also remarkably sophisticated. The humans of the LGM weren't primitive cave dwellers cowering from the cold. They were highly adapted specialists with technologies and survival strategies that would have amazed their ancestors from just 50,000 years earlier. They had developed tailored clothing, not just animal skins draped over their bodies, but carefully sewn garments designed to trap heat and shed moisture. Parkas, pants, boots, mittens. Archaeological evidence from Siberian sites shows bone needles, thread made from animal sinew, and clothing patterns that wouldn't look entirely out of place in a modern Arctic expedition. They had sophisticated shelter technologies, not just natural caves, although they used those when available, but constructed dwellings. The famous mammoth bone houses of Ukraine and Russia, structures built from the skulls, tusks and long bones of mammoths, covered with animal hides and partially buried for insulation. Some of these structures were substantial, capable of housing extended families through brutal winters. Their tools were specialized and effective, carefully designed spear points for different types of prey, specialized butchering tools, hafted implements that maximized mechanical advantage. They had invented the spear thrower or atlatl, which effectively extended the human arm and allowed them to launch projectiles with enough force to penetrate mammoth hide. They knew how to find and exploit the resources that existed in that frozen world. They tracked animal migrations across hundreds of miles. They knew which plants remained edible through winter. They understood ice, how it formed, where it was safe to cross, where meltwater would appear in spring. They could read weather patterns, predict storms, find shelter when conditions became impossible. Most importantly, they maintained social networks across vast distances. Groups separated by hundreds of miles stayed in contact, traded raw materials and finished goods, shared information about resources and dangers, and exchanged members to maintain genetic diversity. The archaeological record shows nearly identical tool styles across enormous geographic ranges, evidence of cultural connections that persisted even when direct contact must have been infrequent. They were also creating art. The famous cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet in France date to the LGM. Carved figurines, decorated tools, shell beads transported hundreds of miles from the coast. These weren't just survival-focused populations. They had the cognitive capacity and the social organization to create culture, to value beauty, to engage in activities that served no immediate survival function. But they were living on a knife's edge. Climate during the LGM wasn't static. It fluctuated on decadal and century timescales. A few bad years could mean starvation for an entire group. A shift in animal migration routes could force abandonment of territories that had been occupied for generations. The ice sheets themselves were dynamic. They advanced and retreated on local scales. Meltwater lakes formed along their margins, sometimes catastrophically draining and reshaping entire landscapes. Glacial winds, katabatic flows of dense cold air sliding off the ice sheets, created local weather conditions that could drop temperatures 50 degrees in a matter of hours, and always, pressing down with the weight of millions of cubic miles of ice, the glaciers were reshaping the continents beneath them. The bedrock was actually sinking under the load, depressing the Earth's crust hundreds of feet in some places. This geological process, called isostatic depression, was storing up potential energy that would eventually reshape coastlines when the ice finally retreated. But the humans of the LGM didn't know any of that. They didn't know they were living at the peak of the last ice age. They couldn't have conceived that the ice sheets had a beginning or would have an end. The glaciers had been there longer than any human memory, longer than any story passed down through generations. They were simply features of the landscape, as permanent as mountains, except they weren't permanent. Because even as human populations adapted to life in the frozen world, even as megafauna herds thundered across the mammoth steppe, even as the ice sheets reached their maximum extent, forces beyond anyone's comprehension were already in motion. The Earth's orbit was shifting. The planet's axial tilt was changing. Solar radiation patterns were being redistributed across the globe. And these astronomical changes, operating on timescales of tens of thousands of years, were about to flip a switch on Earth's climate system. The world under ice was about to begin melting, and when it did, everything would change. So you're living 20,000 years ago. Ice sheets tower over the landscape, miles thick in places, covering a third of the planet's land surface. Your ancestors have known nothing but cold for thousands of generations. The world has always been ice, will always be ice, except it won't, because something is about to change, something that has nothing to do with humans, nothing to do with any single event, but everything to do with how our planet moves through space. Here's the thing about Earth. It doesn't just sit still spinning on a perfect axis in a perfect circle around the sun. It wobbles, it tilts, its orbit stretches and contracts like a slow-motion cosmic dance that takes tens of thousands of years to complete. And these tiny variations in how our planet moves, these barely perceptible changes in our relationship to the sun, they control ice ages. They control when ice sheets grow and when they die. They control in a very real sense whether civilization is even possible. The Serbian mathematician Milutin Milankovic figured this out in the 1920s, calculating by hand the complex interactions of Earth's orbital variations. Nobody believed him at first. The changes seemed too small, too subtle to matter. But he was right. And around 18,000 years ago, those orbital variations began shifting in a way that would melt the world. Three main cycles were converging. First, there's the precession of Earth's axis. Imagine a spinning top wobbling as it spins. That's what Earth does, except one complete wobble takes about 26,000 years. This wobble changes which hemisphere gets more intense sunlight during summer. Around 18,000 years ago, the wobble was shifting to deliver stronger summer sun to the northern hemisphere, where most of Earth's landmass and most of its ice sheets were located. Second, there's the tilt of Earth's axis, what scientists call obliquity. Earth's axis isn't perpendicular to its orbit around the sun. It tilts, currently at about 23.5 degrees, but that angle changes over a 41,000-year cycle, varying between about 22 and 24.5 degrees. More tilt means stronger seasons, hotter summers and colder winters. Less tilt means milder seasons overall. The tilt was increasing, creating more extreme seasonal contrasts. Hotter summers meant more ice melt. Third, there's the shape of Earth's orbit itself, called eccentricity. Sometimes Earth's orbit is nearly circular. Sometimes it's more elliptical, more oval-shaped. The cycle takes about 100,000 years, and it affects how much the distance between Earth and the Sun varies throughout the year. The orbit was becoming more elliptical, creating greater variation in solar energy received at different times of year. Individually, each of these cycles creates relatively small changes in solar radiation, a few percentage points difference in summer sunshine, nothing dramatic. But here's where it gets interesting. They don't work individually, they interact, they amplify each other, and around 18,000 years ago, all three cycles were aligning to maximize summer solar radiation in the northern hemisphere. This wasn't a sudden switch. There was no single day when someone looked up and said, "Hey, it's warmer today." The initial changes were glacial, literally. A fraction of a degree warmer each century. Summers that melted slightly more ice than the previous generation remembered. Winters that deposited slightly less snow. For people living through it, the world probably seemed unchanging. But the ice sheets knew something was different. Those first extra degrees of summer warmth began working on the southern edges of the great ice sheets. Not the thick centres, not yet, but the margins. Places where ice hundreds of feet thick met bedrock or tundra. Summer melt increased. Slightly at first, then year by year, more water running off the ice edges, more dark ground exposed where white ice had been, and here's where physics becomes destiny. White ice reflects most of the sun's energy back into space. Scientists call this albedo, the measure of how reflective a surface is. Fresh snow can reflect up to 90% of incoming solar radiation, but dark soil, dark rock, dark vegetation, they absorb 80–90% of that energy, converting it to heat. So every square mile of ice that melted exposed dark ground that absorbed more heat, which melted more ice, which exposed more dark ground. A feedback loop. Not a gentle slope, but an accelerating spiral. The same thing was happening in the oceans. Ice-covered seas reflect sunlight. Open water absorbs it. As sea ice began retreating, dark ocean absorbed more solar energy, warming the water, melting more ice. The Arctic Ocean was becoming a heat engine, storing summer warmth and releasing it gradually through winter, preventing ice from reforming as extensively as it had before. But the most important feedback loop was happening in the atmosphere itself. Ice sheets lock up water. When they grow, they take water out of the ocean and trap it on land as ice. When they melt, they release that water back, but they also release air, ancient air trapped as bubbles when the snow first fell and compressed into ice, and that air contains carbon dioxide. Now, the amount of CO2 released directly from melting ice is trivial, but the melting triggered other changes that weren't trivial at all. As ice sheets retreated, they exposed soil and vegetation that had been frozen for millennia. Plants that had been locked in ice began decomposing, releasing CO2 and methane. Permafrost started thawing, releasing more greenhouse gases. Most importantly, the warming oceans began releasing dissolved CO2. Cold water holds more CO2 than warm water, so as the oceans warmed, they released massive amounts of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Ice core records from Antarctica show this clearly. Around 18,000 years ago, atmospheric CO2 began rising. Not quickly by modern standards, but steadily, inexorably. From about 180 parts per million during the coldest part of the Ice Age, to eventually 280 parts per million by the time the warming was complete. That extra 100 ppm of CO2 trapped additional heat, warming the planet further, melting more ice, releasing more CO2. Another feedback loop, another accelerating spiral. The ocean currents were changing too. During the Ice Age maximum, ocean circulation had slowed dramatically. The great conveyor belt of currents that normally moves heat from the equator to the poles had been disrupted by cold, fresh meltwater from ice sheets diluting the salty North Atlantic water that normally sinks and drives global circulation. But as the warming accelerated, the circulation began strengthening again. Warm tropical water started flowing north more vigorously, bringing heat to high latitudes, melting ice from below even as the sun melted it from above. Think of it like this. You're trying to keep an ice cube frozen on a warm day. You can put it in the shade, that's like reducing solar radiation. You can insulate it, that's like cloud cover. But if you also run warm water over it while sitting it on a warm plate in the sun, that ice cube doesn't stand a chance. The ice sheets were that ice cube, and every feedback loop was another source of heat they couldn't escape. For several thousand years, this process continued gradually. The ice sheets were massive, containing enough frozen water to raise sea level by 400 feet when fully melted. They didn't disappear overnight. The North American ice sheet, called the Laurentide, covered most of Canada and the northern United States with ice up to 2 miles thick. The Scandinavian ice sheet buried northern Europe under similar depths. These were not fragile structures that would collapse from a few warm summers. But here's what makes this story fascinating. The melting wasn't smooth. It wasn't a gentle, linear progression from Ice Age to modern world. It was chaotic, punctuated by sudden dramatic events, separated by periods of relative stability or even temporary recooling. The climate system doesn't change smoothly. It has thresholds, tipping points where small changes trigger massive responses. Around 16,000 years ago, the melting accelerated, not gradually, but abruptly. Something had shifted in the climate system, possibly a reorganization of ocean currents, possibly the ice sheets reaching a critical threshold of instability. Suddenly, instead of slow retreat, ice was collapsing. Glaciers that had been stable for millennia began surging forward, breaking apart, carving massive icebergs into the ocean. Sea level, which had been rising slowly, began jumping upward in pulses that would reshape coastlines in decades rather than centuries. Then just as suddenly the warming would pause. Sometimes it would even reverse temporarily, with ice advancing again for a few centuries before the overall warming trend reasserted itself. These weren't gentle fluctuations. These were whiplash climate shifts that would have been terrifying to experience. Imagine living through a period when the climate was warming, forests expanding, resources becoming more abundant, only to have it suddenly reverse. Cold, slamming back, winters becoming brutal again, the brief abundance vanishing. The climate was no longer stable. It was thrashing between states, like a system trying to find a new equilibrium, but overshooting repeatedly. And the worst of these reversals was still to come. But for now, around 15,000 years ago, the warming was winning. The ice sheets were in full retreat, not collapsing entirely, but shrinking year by year, century by century. Meltwater was pouring off them in volumes hard to comprehend. Rivers the size of the Amazon, flowing only in summer, carrying the frozen remnants of the Ice Age into the warming oceans. And here's the crucial point that people living through this probably never understood. The warming wasn't being caused by anything on Earth. It wasn't volcanic eruptions, wasn't changes in the sun's energy output, wasn't anything happening in the atmosphere or oceans. The root cause was orbital mechanics. the dance of Earth through space, cycles that had repeated for millions of years. The ice ages came and went on a schedule determined by celestial mechanics, as regular and predictable as eclipses. But the effects of those small orbital changes were being massively amplified by feedback loops. The initial warming from increased summer sunshine was tiny, barely enough to notice. But each small change triggered responses that triggered more responses, cascading through the climate system, turning a gentle nudge into an overwhelming transformation. The Ice Age was ending not because Earth wanted it to end, but because physics demanded it. Because orbital mechanics had aligned in a way that made ice sheets untenable. Because feedback loops, once started, become self-sustaining. The ice had dominated for 100,000 years, but its reign was ending. The great melt had begun, and it was about to become catastrophic. Around 14,600 years ago, something happened that would have seemed like the end of the world. Not gradually, not over millennia, but within the span of just a few human lifetimes. The sea level rose by 50 to 80 feet. Let that sink in for a moment. 50 to 80 feet. In 340 to 500 years, that's roughly 15 to 25 centimeters per generation. Enough that grandparents could tell their grandchildren stories about beaches and fishing grounds that now lay beneath the waves. Enough that entire coastlines, complete with the camps, settlements, and territories that humans had occupied for thousands of years, simply vanished beneath rising water. This is what scientists call Meltwater Pulse 1A. The name sounds clinical, almost boring. But what it describes is one of the most catastrophic events in recent Earth history, a planetary-scale flood that redrew the map of the world and may have been seared into human cultural memory so deeply that we're still telling stories about it today. Because here's the thing about Meltwater Pulse 1A. It wasn't supposed to happen. Well, not like that anyway. Climate scientists studying the end of the Ice Age expected a gradual warming, a slow retreat of glaciers over thousands of years. What they found instead was evidence of multiple sudden lurches, periods when the melting accelerated dramatically, when ice sheets that had seemed stable for millennia suddenly collapsed, dumping staggering volumes of fresh water into the world's oceans. Pulse 1A was the first of these events, and it was absolutely massive. To understand what happened, you have to picture the world as it existed 15,000 years ago. The great ice sheets that covered northern North America and Europe were beginning to retreat, but they were still enormous. The Laurentide ice sheet alone, which covered most of Canada and reached down into what's now the northern United States, was up to 2 miles thick in places. That's ice piled so high that if you stood at its base and looked up, you literally couldn't see the top. These ice sheets contained incomprehensible amounts of water, enough to lower global sea levels by 400 feet compared to today. Enough that you could walk from Asia to North America across the Bering Land Bridge. Enough that Indonesia, the Philippines, and mainland Asia were all connected by dry land. Enough that the entire Persian Gulf was an empty river valley. Then something happened. We're still not entirely sure what. The leading theory is that massive sections of the Antarctic ice sheet suddenly destabilized and collapsed. We're talking about ice shelves the size of entire countries breaking free and sliding into the Southern Ocean. The evidence comes from sediment cores taken from the ocean floor around Antarctica, which show massive deposits of ice-rafted debris, rocks and soil that had been frozen inside glaciers for thousands of years, suddenly dumped into the ocean as the ice melted. But Antarctica probably wasn't the only culprit. At the same time, the great ice sheets in North America were developing catastrophic weaknesses. As temperatures rose, meltwater began pooling on top of the ice and along its edges. This water acted like lubricant, allowing huge sections of ice to slide toward the ocean faster than they could melt. Even more dramatically, enormous glacial lakes formed where ice dams held back the meltwater. These weren't small ponds. We're talking about bodies of water larger than the Great Lakes, held back by walls of ice hundreds of feet high. When those dams failed, and they did fail, the results were apocalyptic. Imagine a wall of water 300 feet high moving at 60 miles per hour, carrying icebergs the size of office buildings, scouring the landscape down to bedrock. The geological evidence for these megafloods is written across the landscape of North America. In Washington state, the channeled scablands show exactly what happens when an ice dam fails, and an entire glacial lake empties in a matter of days. Giant ripples in the bedrock, each one taller than a house. Boulders the size of cars carried hundreds of miles from their source. Channels carved through solid rock by water moving so fast and carrying so much debris that it could erode anything in its path. And this wasn't a one-time event. It happened repeatedly. Every time an ice dam formed and then failed, every time a section of ice sheet collapsed, each flood would have been a catastrophe on its own. Together they poured enough fresh water into the North Atlantic to fundamentally alter the ocean's circulation. But the most dramatic flooding was happening along the coasts. As all this meltwater poured into the oceans, sea levels rose at rates that would be considered catastrophic, even by today's standards. Coastal areas around the world were experiencing regular inundation, not all at once, but relentlessly. Year after year, season after season, the water kept coming. For human populations living along the coasts, and most of them were because coastlines offered the most abundant and reliable food sources, this would have been existentially terrifying. Imagine living in a world where the boundary between land and sea is constantly shifting, where fishing camps you've used for generations are underwater within your lifetime, where territories that your people have occupied for thousands of years are being consumed by the advancing ocean. The evidence for this great drowning is everywhere, if you know where to look. Coral reefs that formed in shallow water 14,000 years ago are now submerged beneath 50 feet of ocean. Ancient shorelines are preserved on continental shelves far below the modern sea level. Sediment cores from the ocean floor show distinct layers corresponding to the massive freshwater influx, recognizable by the types of plankton fossils they contain. Freshwater species suddenly appearing in ocean sediments, then disappearing just as quickly as the pulse passed. But the most compelling evidence comes from what the flooding did to the world's ocean circulation. The oceans don't just sit there. They're in constant motion, driven by differences in temperature and salinity. The North Atlantic is particularly important because it's where the warm Gulf Stream current reaches its northern limit, releases its heat to the atmosphere, becomes denser as it cools, and sinks to begin the deep ocean return flow back south. This circulation pattern is what keeps Europe habitable despite being at the same latitude as northern Canada. When Meltwater Pulse 1A dumped massive amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic, it disrupted this entire system. Fresh water is less dense than salt water. It doesn't sink as readily. The enormous pulse of meltwater essentially formed a lid on top of the North Atlantic, preventing the normal circulation from functioning. The Gulf Stream slowed, maybe even stopped temporarily. Heat stopped flowing northward, and the climate response was immediate and dramatic. This is probably what triggered the Younger Dryas, the 1,000-year return to near-glacial conditions that we'll explore in detail shortly. But first, we need to understand what Meltwater Pulse 1a meant for the humans who lived through it. Because here's the reality. Most human settlements at the end of the Ice Age were coastal. The interior was still dominated by ice sheets, tundra, and harsh environments. The coasts offered predictable food resources: fish, shellfish, marine mammals, seabirds. Archaeological evidence suggests that coastal populations were more numerous, more settled, and more culturally sophisticated than their inland counterparts. And Meltwater Pulse 1a drowned their entire world. We're talking about thousands of miles of coastline, representing tens of thousands of square miles of territory, disappearing beneath the waves. Entire landscapes where humans had been living, hunting, gathering, and creating culture for thousands of years. Gone. Not destroyed suddenly, but slowly enough that people could watch it happening, fast enough that they couldn't adapt in place. The human response was what you'd expect: retreat. Populations moved inland, seeking higher ground, competing for territories that were already occupied. This would have created resource pressure, conflict, forced migrations. Groups that had been separated by geography suddenly found themselves in contact, competition, and sometimes conflict. But it also created something else: stories. Every human culture on Earth has flood myths. The biblical Noah's Ark is probably the most famous in Western culture, but it's hardly unique. The Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia describes a catastrophic flood that destroys the world. Hindu texts describe Manu, who survives a great flood and rebuilds humanity. Aboriginal Australian stories tell of times when the sea rose and drowned coastal lands. Pacific Islander traditions preserve detailed knowledge of islands and coastlines that now lie beneath the waves. For decades, scholars dismissed these as pure mythology, symbolic rather than historical. But what if they're not? What if they're cultural memories of real events, passed down through hundreds of generations? Meltwater Pulse 1a happened within the time frame of modern human history. We were there. We watched the coasts drown. We experienced the terror of rising waters that wouldn't stop. We told our children about the lands that lay beneath the waves, and they told their children, and those stories evolved and morphed over thousands of years but never quite disappeared. The scale of Meltwater Pulse 1a is difficult to comprehend from our modern perspective. We think of sea level rise as a future threat, something measured in millimeters per year, something that happens slowly enough for societies to adapt. But 14,600 years ago, people watched their world drown at rates 20 times faster than what we're experiencing today. They didn't have the scientific knowledge to understand what was happening. They couldn't know that it was ice melting thousands of miles away, that it was a global phenomenon, that it would eventually stop. All they knew was that the sea was rising, their lands were vanishing, and the world was fundamentally changing in ways that must have seemed supernatural. If you were living through it, if you watched the shoreline advance year after year, if you had to abandon settlement after settlement as the water kept coming, wouldn't it seem like the gods were angry? Wouldn't it seem like the world was ending? Wouldn't you tell that story to your children, and wouldn't they tell their children, until it became encoded in the deepest myths of your culture? Meltwater Pulse 1a changed the map of the world. It ended the Ice Age coastlines forever, created the sea levels that would define human civilization for the next 14,000 years. But it also might have changed something deeper: our collective memory, our cultural consciousness, our understanding that the world we live in is not permanent, that catastrophe can come not as sudden apocalypse but as slow, relentless change that cannot be stopped or reversed. And the pulse itself? It eventually ended. The ice that collapsed had collapsed. The water that could flow had flowed. Sea levels stabilized, at least temporarily. But the damage was done. The North Atlantic circulation was disrupted. The climate was destabilized, and the stage was set for what happened next. The Younger Dryas, when the ice came roaring back for one final desperate attempt at reclaiming the world. Just when humanity thought it had figured things out, the world hit the reset button. 12,900 years ago, right in the middle of the Great Melt, right when temperatures were rising and ice sheets were retreating and humans were spreading into newly habitable territories, everything suddenly reversed. Within a single human lifetime, maybe less, the climate crashed back toward Ice Age conditions. It was like the planet changed its mind. Scientists call this period the Younger Dryas, named after an Arctic wildflower called Dryas octopetala that suddenly reappeared in regions where it hadn't grown for thousands of years. But that gentle botanical name hides something terrifying. This wasn't a gradual cooling trend. This was climate whiplash on a scale that would seem impossible if we didn't have overwhelming evidence that it actually happened. The temperature data from Greenland ice cores tells the story with brutal precision. In less than a decade, maybe as little as 3 years, average temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped by 15 degrees Celsius. That's 27 degrees Fahrenheit in 3 years. To put that in perspective, imagine if the temperature where you live suddenly matched somewhere 1,000 miles closer to the nearest pole, permanently, within your child's lifetime. Ice sheets that had been retreating for 7,000 years suddenly stopped and began advancing again. Glaciers in Scandinavia pushed south, grinding over territories that had been ice-free for millennia. In North America, the Laurentide ice sheet, which had been melting steadily, thickened and spread. Alpine glaciers in the mountains of Europe and Asia reversed their retreat and started flowing downhill again. But here's what makes the Younger Dryas truly bizarre. It wasn't global. While the North Atlantic region and areas connected to it plunged back into near-glacial conditions, other parts of the world experienced much milder effects, or none at all. New Zealand actually got warmer during the Younger Dryas. Parts of South America show no climate disruption at all during this period. Antarctica barely noticed. This regional pattern is the key to understanding what happened. Because whatever caused the Younger Dryas, it wasn't a simple cooling of the entire planet. It was something that specifically disrupted the climate system of the Northern Hemisphere, while leaving much of the Southern Hemisphere relatively unaffected. The leading theory involves the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, which you might know better as the Gulf Stream, though that's technically just one part of it. This is the massive conveyor belt of ocean currents that carries warm water from the tropics to the North Atlantic, then sends cold water back south along the ocean floor. It's what keeps Europe significantly warmer than it should be at its latitude. Without it, London would have the climate of Labrador. The system depends on a delicate balance of temperature and salinity. Warm, salty water flows north at the surface. As it cools near Greenland and Norway, it becomes denser and sinks, creating a massive downwelling that pulls more warm water north behind it. The cold water flows south along the bottom of the ocean, eventually rising and warming again in the tropics. Round and round it goes, transferring enormous amounts of heat from the equator to the Arctic. But here's the vulnerability. The system relies on that water being salty enough to sink when it cools. If you suddenly dump massive amounts of fresh water into the North Atlantic, the water becomes less dense. Even when it cools, it might not sink, and if it doesn't sink, the whole circulation pattern can slow down or even stop. That's exactly what researchers think happened 12,900 years ago. For thousands of years, the melting Laurentide ice sheet had been pooling meltwater in a massive glacial lake called Lake Agassiz. This thing was enormous, covering much of what's now Manitoba, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and parts of the northern United States. At its maximum, it held more water than all of today's Great Lakes combined. For millennia, this lake had drained south through the Mississippi River system. But as the ice sheet continued melting, new drainage routes opened up. Suddenly, catastrophically, the entire lake found a new path to the ocean. Not south through the Mississippi, but east through the Great Lakes and the St. Lawrence River, or possibly north through the Mackenzie River into the Arctic Ocean. Billions upon billions of gallons of fresh water poured into the North Atlantic over a period of months or years. The ocean's surface salinity plummeted. The warm, salty water from the tropics couldn't sink anymore. The Atlantic meridional overturning circulation slowed dramatically, or perhaps stopped completely. And without that massive heat transfer system, the North Atlantic region plunged into a deep freeze. But that's just the leading theory. The truth is, we're not entirely sure what triggered the Younger Dryas, and there might have been multiple factors working together. Some researchers point to evidence of an extraterrestrial impact. They found a thin layer of sediment dating to exactly 12,900 years ago that contains unusual materials, nanodiamonds, which can form during impacts, magnetic spherules, high concentrations of iridium and platinum, elements that are rare on Earth's surface but common in asteroids and comets, a thin layer of carbon-rich material suggesting massive wildfires. The impact hypothesis suggests that a comet or asteroid, possibly a fragment of a larger object, exploded over North America or impacted the Laurentide ice sheet itself. The explosion would have instantly melted massive amounts of ice, triggering the meltwater flood into the North Atlantic. It would have ignited continent-wide wildfires. The impact debris thrown into the atmosphere could have blocked sunlight, causing rapid cooling. The evidence is controversial. Some scientists argue the materials in that sediment layer can be explained by other processes: wildfires, volcanic eruptions, terrestrial impacts of space dust. The debate continues, but the timing is suspicious. That layer appears at exactly the moment when the climate crashed. Others point to volcanic activity. The period around the Younger Dryas onset shows evidence of increased volcanism in several regions. Large eruptions can inject massive amounts of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating aerosols that reflect sunlight and cool the planet. A series of major eruptions in quick succession could potentially trigger rapid cooling. There's even a solar hypothesis. Some researchers think variations in solar output, combined with changes in Earth's magnetic field, could have reduced the amount of solar radiation reaching the planet just enough to tip the climate system into a cold snap. The truth might involve all of these factors working together. Maybe the circulation was already weakening due to gradual meltwater input. Then a comet impact or major volcanic eruption provided the final push, dumping enough fresh water or blocking enough sunlight to shut down the system entirely. Whatever the cause, the effects were devastating, and they're written in the geological record with stunning clarity. Ice cores from Greenland show a sharp spike in dust and lower snow accumulation, indicating colder, drier conditions. Lake sediments across Europe show a sudden change from temperate plant species to cold, adapted Arctic vegetation. Cave formations in places like China show altered precipitation patterns, Even the ocean floor tells the story. Deep-sea sediment cores show a dramatic change in the types of microscopic organisms, reflecting colder surface waters. But the most haunting evidence comes from the animals that died during this period. The Younger Dryas marks an acceleration in the megafauna extinctions that had been happening across North America since humans arrived on the continent. Mammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, enormous short-faced bears. Species that had survived previous ice ages suddenly couldn't cope with this rapid climate reversal. Some researchers think the Younger Dryas was the final straw for animals already stressed by human hunting. Others argue the climate change itself was enough to push them over the edge. Most likely it was both. Human populations had been growing across the Americas for several thousand years. Large animals were being hunted. Their populations were already in decline. Then suddenly, in the span of a few years, the climate they had adapted to over thousands of generations shifted violently. Grasslands that had been expanding as the Ice Age ended suddenly retreated again. Food sources disappeared. Migration routes were disrupted. For animals living on the edge, it was too much. They vanished, leaving behind only their bones frozen in the tundra or preserved in tar pits. But here's what's really remarkable. Humans survived. Not just survived, but in many cases actually thrived during the Younger Dryas. This tells us something profound about human adaptability. Some human groups definitely suffered. The archaeological record shows population declines in certain regions. Sites that had been occupied for generations were suddenly abandoned. Trade networks that had connected distant communities broke down. Some cultural traditions simply disappeared, probably along with the people who practiced them. But other groups adapted quickly. In the Middle East, there's evidence that the Younger Dryas actually accelerated the development of agriculture. As wild food sources became less reliable, people were forced to invest more effort in cultivating and managing plant resources. The first permanent agricultural settlements appear right at the end of the Younger Dryas period, as if the climate crisis had pushed people to develop new survival strategies. In North America, groups adapted by becoming more mobile, following game animals as they moved in response to shifting vegetation zones. Tool technologies changed to reflect new hunting strategies. In Europe, people moved to coastal areas where marine resources provided more reliable food sources than terrestrial hunting. The Younger Dryas became a filter, selecting for human groups that were flexible, innovative, and capable of rapid cultural change. Those who could adapt their strategies quickly survived and flourished. Those who couldn't disappeared from history. For 1,200 years this cold snap persisted. 12 centuries of returned Ice Age conditions. Multiple generations lived and died, never knowing anything except the cold. Grandparents told stories about a warmer time when the ice retreated and grasslands expanded, but young people must have wondered if those stories were just myths. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the Younger Dryas ended. 11,700 years ago, within a span of perhaps 50 years, temperatures rocketed upward again. Ice cores from Greenland show warming of 10 degrees Celsius in a single decade. The Atlantic circulation restarted. Warm water began flowing north again. Ice sheets resumed their retreat, this time for good. Nobody knows exactly what triggered the end either. Maybe the ocean's salinity gradually recovered as the fresh water dispersed. Maybe the ice dam holding back another glacial lake finally broke, but this time the resulting circulation changes actually helped restart the system rather than shut it down. Maybe it was just the natural end of whatever cycle had caused the cold period in the first place. But whatever the cause, the result was definitive. The Younger Dryas was over. The Ice Age was finally, truly done. The Holocene epoch, our current geological period, had begun. The world humanity would come to dominate, the climate we would build civilizations within, the environmental conditions we've known for all of recorded history, all of it started in that moment 11,700 years ago, when the ice stopped returning and the warmth came back to stay. But the damage was done. The world that emerged from the Younger Dryas was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before it, and the stage was set for the next great transformation. The drowning of the old world and the birth of the new. But here's what most people don't understand about the end of the Ice Age. It wasn't just the glaciers melting, it wasn't just the mammoths dying, it was the drowning of entire worlds, lands that had been home to thousands, maybe millions of people for tens of thousands of years, gone, swallowed by rising seas that came so slowly they were almost invisible, generation by generation, yet so unstoppably that nothing could save them. We're talking about approximately 400 feet of sea level rise. 400 feet. Picture a 40-story building. Now imagine the ocean climbing from ground level to the roof over the course of 10,000 years. That's about half an inch per year on average. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But here's the thing about coastal areas. They're not steep cliffs dropping straight into the ocean. They're gentle slopes, shallow continental shelves that extend for miles. When the water rises half an inch, it doesn't just climb up the beach half an inch. It floods inland by yards, sometimes miles, depending on the terrain. And it never stops. Year after year, generation after generation, the water keeps coming. The beach your great-great-grandparents knew, gone. The fishing grounds your grandparents relied on, underwater. The settlements your parents were born in, abandoned to the waves. For 10,000 years, coastal communities around the world lived with this slow-motion catastrophe, always retreating, always moving inland, always losing ground to the sea. Let's start with Doggerland, because if you've never heard of it, you should have. It was one of the richest, most productive landscapes in Ice Age Europe. A vast plain, roughly the size of modern Britain, stretching from what is now eastern England across to the Netherlands, Germany and Denmark. And it wasn't some frozen wasteland. During the Ice Age, with so much water locked up in glaciers, the North Sea was dry land. Rolling hills and river valleys, marshes and forests, teeming with game. Doggerland was the heartland of northern Europe. Archaeological evidence suggests it supported substantial human populations for thousands of years. People living in permanent settlements, exploiting rich coastal resources, hunting massive herds of reindeer and wild horses. The land was so productive that some researchers think Doggerland populations might have actually been larger and more prosperous than communities living on what is now mainland Europe. They had everything figured out: seasonal migration patterns to follow game, fishing grounds in the river's and estuaries, trade networks connecting communities across hundreds of miles. For generation after generation after generation, this was home. But the seas were rising. Around 18,000 years ago, Doggerland was still completely dry. By 12,000 years ago, the southern edges were beginning to flood. By 10,000 years ago, it had become an increasingly narrow isthmus, a shrinking land bridge between Britain and Europe. The people living there had to keep moving. As the coastline advanced, communities would relocate inland, abandoning settlements that had been occupied for centuries. Archaeological sites that once sat comfortably inland gradually became coastal, then tidal, then submerged entirely. The richest hunting grounds disappeared first, then the river valleys filled with salt water, killing the freshwater fish populations. Forest turned to marsh, marsh to tidal flat to open sea. By 8,200 years ago, the process was almost complete. Britain had become an island. The last remnants of Doggerland were a scatter of low islands in what is now the North Sea. Maybe a few desperate communities clinging to hilltops that were becoming smaller with every tide. And then those islands disappeared too. An entire world gone. Thousands of years of human history drowned beneath waves that are still there today, rolling over the fishing grounds where trawlers now pull up ancient human artifacts along with modern catches. Across the Atlantic, something similar was happening to Beringia. This was the land bridge connecting Asia to North America, the gateway through which the first Americans had walked into a virgin continent. But Beringia wasn't just a bridge. It was a landscape in its own right. A vast plain up to 1,000 miles wide, stretching from Siberia to Alaska. And like Doggerland, it was rich. Cold, yes. Harsh, absolutely. But productive in ways that might surprise you. The exposed seabed created what scientists call a mammoth steppe ecosystem. Grasslands and tundra supporting huge populations of mammoths, horses, bison, and caribou. The kind of place where skilled hunters could thrive. For at least 15,000 years, maybe longer, Beringia was home to human populations who had adapted perfectly to this environment. They were the staging ground for the colonization of the Americas. Wave after wave of migrants moving east, following game herds into Alaska and beyond. But starting around 14,000 years ago, the seas began reclaiming Beringia. The southern edge flooded first, cutting off the easiest routes between continents. By 11,000 years ago, the land bridge had narrowed to a fraction of its Ice Age extent. Communities that had lived on what they thought was solid ground suddenly found themselves on shrinking peninsulas, watching the ocean advance year by year. By 10,000 years ago, the Bering Strait had reopened. Asia and America were separated again. The gateway was closed. Those final populations trapped on Beringia as it shrank. We don't know what happened to them. Maybe they migrated east or west, rejoining larger populations. Maybe they tried to stay, living on the last high ground until the rising seas took even that. Either way, an entire corridor of human migration, a landscape that had facilitated one of the greatest journeys in human history, vanished beneath the waves. But the greatest loss, the most catastrophic drowning, happened in Southeast Asia. This was Sunderland, and it wasn't just big, it was massive. During the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were at their lowest, the entire continental shelf between mainland Southeast Asia and the islands of Indonesia was exposed. We're talking about an area the size of India, a vast extension of the Asian continent, connecting modern-day Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines into one enormous landmass. And here's what makes Sunderland so tragic. It was probably the richest, most productive human habitat in the Ice Age world. Tropical climate even during the glacial maximum. Rivers, forests, coastlines teeming with resources. No harsh winters. No massive seasonal migrations necessary. Year-round abundance. Some researchers think Sunderland might have supported the largest human populations anywhere on Earth during the Ice Age. Not scattered bands of a few dozen people, but substantial communities, maybe villages, possibly even proto-cities if such things existed 15,000 years ago. But we have almost no archaeological evidence for this, because it's all underwater. Every settlement, every tool, every artwork, every burial site created by thousands of years of human habitation in Sunderland now sits beneath 200 feet of tropical seawater. The rise and seas claimed nearly the entire landmass. By 10,000 years ago, only the highest elevations remained above water. What we now know as Indonesia and the Philippines, the peaks of mountains that once rose from vast coastal plains. The displacement must have been staggering. If Sunderland really did support dense populations, we're talking about millions of people forced to relocate over the course of several thousand years, moving inland, climbing into highlands that were already occupied, competing for resources in an ever-shrinking land area. The genetic and cultural consequences would have been enormous. Populations mixing and merging, languages diverging and evolving, social structures adapting to new realities. This might explain one of the great mysteries of Southeast Asian history. Why is there such incredible cultural and linguistic diversity in the region? Why do the Philippines alone have over 180 languages? Maybe because the flooding of Sunderland created exactly the conditions for rapid cultural divergence. Populations that had once been connected by vast coastal plains suddenly found themselves isolated on separate islands, evolving independently for thousands of years. Other drowned worlds tell similar stories. The Persian Gulf during the Ice Age wasn't a gulf at all. It was a fertile river valley, fed by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, flowing through what is now the seabed. Some researchers think this lost valley might have been one of the most productive landscapes in the Middle East, a potential cradle for early agriculture, now buried beneath the sea. The Black Sea has an even more dramatic story. Around 7,600 years ago, it wasn't connected to the Mediterranean. It was a smaller freshwater lake, sitting far below global sea level. Farming communities had spread around its shores, taking advantage of rich soils and reliable water. Then, catastrophically, the rising Mediterranean breached the narrow land barrier at what is now the Bosphorus Strait. Salt water came pouring through in what some geologists think might have been the largest waterfall in human history. The Black Sea rose hundreds of feet in a matter of months, maybe even weeks. Entire settlements disappeared. Thousands of square miles of prime agricultural land drowned in a geological instant. For the people living there, it must have seemed like the end of the world. Some researchers think this event might be the historical basis for flood myths that appear in multiple Middle Eastern cultures. The biblical flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh, not a global deluge, but a regional catastrophe that destroyed an entire civilization's homeland. In Australia, Aboriginal communities watched their coastlines retreat inland by up to 150 miles in some areas. Sacred sites, camping grounds, seasonal gathering places that had been used for tens of thousands of years, all gradually claimed by the sea. Oral traditions from multiple Aboriginal groups describe this process. Stories of lands that sank, of ancestors who had to flee rising waters. Western scientists dismissed these as myths for generations. Now we know their historical accounts, memories of real events preserved through 300 generations of storytelling. Modern archaeology is finally catching up. Underwater surveys of continental shelves around the world are discovering what coastal communities have suspected for decades. The seabed is full of human artifacts, stone tools, hearths, even structural remains. Off the coast of British Columbia, archaeologists have found human settlements dating to 14,000 years ago, now submerged under 150 feet of water. In the Mediterranean, divers regularly discover ancient coastlines, complete with the remains of Neolithic settlements. We're only beginning to understand what was lost. Every year, new underwater archaeological sites reveal more about the rich coastal cultures that once thrived on lands that now sea floor. But the vast majority remains unexplored, buried under sediment, scattered by millennia of currents, inaccessible to all but the most sophisticated research expeditions. Think about what this means for our understanding of human history. We study Ice Age humans from their inland sites, caves and rock shelters, places that stayed dry as the seas rose. But these were probably marginal habitats, refuges rather than homes. The real centres of Ice Age culture were likely on the coasts, on the rich productive lands where ocean met land. And those are all underwater now. We're trying to understand human prehistory while missing most of the evidence. It's like trying to understand modern civilization by studying only mountain villages while ignoring all the coastal cities. The Great Drowning reshaped human geography in ways we're still living with. It concentrated populations inland, forcing migrations and cultural mixing on an unprecedented scale. It closed migration routes and created new barriers. It drowned thousands of years of coastal cultural development and forced humanity to start over in new territories. And it did all of this so gradually that no single generation fully understood what was happening. Just a slow, inexorable retreat. A world that kept getting smaller. A horizon that kept moving inland. For 10,000 years, until finally the seas stabilized at roughly their modern levels, the drowning stopped, the new world was revealed, and humanity had to figure out how to live on what was left. But something else was happening during the Great Thaw, something that would transform every ecosystem on the planet, something that's still affecting the world you live in today. The Ice Age giants were dying. Between 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, an extinction event unfolded that rivaled anything since the asteroid that killed the dinosaurs. Except this time, there was no asteroid, no volcanic super-eruption, no obvious single catastrophe. Just a steady, relentless disappearance of the largest land animals that had ever walked alongside humans. Start with North America. Before the ice began retreating, it was basically Pleistocene Park. Mammoths wandering in herds across vast grasslands, their massive bulk adapted perfectly to extracting nutrition from tough Ice Age vegetation. Mastodons browsing in spruce forests, using their straighter tusks to strip bark and break branches. Horses. Not the domesticated animals we know today, but wild species that had evolved on the continent for millions of years. Camels. Yes, camels, because North America was where they originally came from before some populations wandered across the Bering Land Bridge into Asia. Giant ground sloths the size of elephants, moving slowly through woodlands, using enormous claws to pull down tree branches. Glyptodonts, basically a Volkswagen-sized armadillos with club tails. Short-faced bears, the largest terrestrial predators of the Ice Age, standing 12 feet tall on their hind legs. Saber-toothed cats with those infamous 7-inch canines, perfectly designed for slicing through the thick hides of Megafauna prey. And then, between 13,000 and 10,000 years ago, 80% of North America's large mammal genera vanished. Not declined, not reduced, vanished, completely extinct. South America suffered even worse. The continent had been isolated for millions of years, developing its own bizarre and wonderful collection of large animals, giant armadillos, terror birds, flightless predators standing 10 feet tall with beaks that could crush bone. Toxodon, massive rhino-like creatures that were actually more closely related to horses. South American horses, camels and llamas that had migrated down from the north. When the Ice Age ended, they all disappeared. The extinction rate in South America exceeded even North America's losses. Some estimates suggest up to 83 of the continent's large mammal genera went extinct within a few thousand years. But here's where the story gets complicated. The timing wasn't the same everywhere. Australia's megafauna disappeared much earlier, between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, long before the last glacial maximum even reached its peak. Giant wombats the size of rhinos, marsupial lions with opposable thumbs, Diprotodon, the largest marsupial that ever lived, weighing up to 6,000 pounds, a land crocodile that hunted on dry ground, massive flightless birds, all gone, thousands of years before the Great Thaw even began. Europe and Asia lost their megafauna too, but more gradually. Woolly rhinoceros, perfectly adapted to the cold steppes, disappeared around 14,000 years ago. Cave bears, which had survived multiple ice age cycles, went extinct around 24,000 years ago. Giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet. Cave hyenas, cave lions twice the size of modern African lions. The pattern was clear. The biggest animals were disappearing. But why? For decades, scientists have fought over this question. Two camps emerged, each with compelling evidence: climate change versus human hunting, the planet's two most destructive forces going head-to-head in an argument about who killed the Ice Age giants. The climate change hypothesis seemed obvious at first. The world was transforming rapidly, temperatures rising, ice sheets melting, sea levels surging, entire ecosystems shifting hundreds of miles north as vegetation patterns changed. The mammoth steppe, that vast grassland that had supported enormous herbivore populations, was being replaced by forests and tundra. Different plants, different growing patterns, different nutritional value. Large animals are specialists. They evolve over millions of years to exploit specific resources in specific ways. Mammoths weren't just big elephants who happened to like the cold. They were precision-engineered grass-processing machines with specialized teeth, digestive systems, and behaviors all optimized for Ice Age conditions. When those conditions changed rapidly, the argument goes, they simply couldn't adapt fast enough. The evidence for climate-driven extinction is substantial. You can see it in the fossil record. Mammoth populations declining as forests expand and grasslands shrink. Mastodons disappearing as their preferred spruce woodlands shift northward faster than the animals can follow. Species restricted to smaller and smaller refuges as their habitat transforms around them. But then you look at the bigger picture, and problems emerge. These animals had survived previous warming periods, multiple Ice Age cycles over millions of years. Why did this particular warming prove fatal when earlier ones hadn't? The Pleistocene was defined by climate fluctuations, glacials and interglacials coming and going every 100,000 years or so. The megafauna had weathered all of it, until now. Enter the overkill hypothesis, and this is where humans become the story. The correlation is difficult to ignore. Megafauna extinctions closely follow the arrival of humans in different regions. Australia loses its giants between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, right when humans first arrive on the continent. North America's extinctions accelerate dramatically after 13,000 years ago, coinciding with the expansion of Clovis culture and widespread human presence. New Zealand loses its moa birds within a few hundred years of Polynesian settlement around 1300 AD. Madagascar loses its elephant birds and giant lemurs shortly after humans arrive around 2,000 years ago. Every single landmass where humans showed up for the first time experienced megafauna extinctions. Africa and parts of Asia kept more of their large animals, but these were places where humans had been evolving alongside the megafauna for millions of years. The animals had time to develop wariness, to learn that these clever bipedal apes were dangerous. But in the Americas, Australia, the islands, the megafauna had never seen humans before. No evolutionary history of humans as predators, no instinctive fear. Archaeological evidence suggests they just stood there while hunters approached, made no attempt to flee, easy targets for people armed with sophisticated weapons and cooperative hunting strategies. Here's what makes the overkill hypothesis so devastating. Humans didn't have to hunt these animals to extinction directly. They just had to tip the balance. Large mammals have slow reproduction rates. An elephant takes 22 months to produce a single calf. Mammoths probably similar. They have long lives, which means they've evolved to tolerate low mortality rates. Lose a few adults every year, fine, the population can handle it. But increase adult mortality by even a small amount, and the math becomes terminal. Let's say a mammoth population has a natural death rate of 2% per year. The population is stable, producing just enough babies to replace losses. Now humans arrive and start hunting. They don't need to kill many. Maybe they take an additional 2-3% of the population annually. Suddenly the death rate exceeds the birth rate. The population begins shrinking, and once you're in negative population growth, extinction becomes inevitable without intervention. It's just a matter of time. The Blitzkrieg model of extinction suggests this process could be shockingly fast. Computer simulations show that small human populations with even modest hunting success could drive large mammal species to extinction within a few hundred years. The animals never had a chance. But here's what really happened. It wasn't just climate change. It wasn't just human hunting. It was both. A lethal combination that proved impossible for the megafauna to survive. The climate was changing rapidly, fragmenting habitats, reducing food availability, forcing animals into smaller refuges, already stressed populations trying to adapt to new conditions, and then humans show up. Not in overwhelming numbers, just a few thousand hunters, but armed with sophisticated weapons, cooperative strategies, and no cultural traditions of conservation because these species were new to them. The combination was devastating. Climate change weakened the populations. Human hunting delivered the killing blow. Species that might have survived either threat alone couldn't survive both simultaneously. And once the megafauna began disappearing, cascading effects transformed entire ecosystems in ways we're still discovering today. Large herbivores are ecosystem engineers. Mammoths knocked down trees, maintaining grasslands. Without them, forests expanded, changing fire patterns, soil composition, vegetation structure. Their dung fertilized vast areas and dispersed seeds across enormous ranges. When they vanished, nutrient cycling patterns shifted fundamentally. Large predators regulate prey populations, preventing overgrazing, maintaining biodiversity. Without saber-toothed cats and short-faced bears, prey species populations fluctuated more wildly, putting different pressure on vegetation communities. The loss of megafauna even affected the climate itself. Recent research suggests that the extinction of large herbivores across the mammoth steppe contributed to warming by reducing grassland extent. Forests absorb more heat than grasslands. The shift from steppe to tundra and a forest may have created a positive feedback loop, accelerating the warming that had contributed to the animal's extinction in the first place. Africa gives us a glimpse of what was lost. It's the only place that still has abundant megafauna, still has ecosystems shaped by interactions between multiple large herbivore and predator species: elephants, rhinos, hippos, giraffes, lions, leopards, hyenas, wild dogs. Complex ecological relationships refined over millions of years. The rest of the world lost this complexity, lost the spectacle of mammoth herds migrating across continents, lost the terror of short-faced bears patrolling grasslands, lost giant sloths shaping forests with their browsing, lost ecological relationships so ancient they predated modern humans, and we're still living with the consequences. The grasslands of North America behave differently than African savannas because they lost their megafauna. They're missing the animals that would have kept woody vegetation in check, distributed nutrients, created habitat complexity. Plant species evolved to have their seeds dispersed by extinct megafauna, now struggle to reproduce and spread. Some researchers call them evolutionary anachronisms, plants still waiting for animals that died 10,000 years ago. Honey locust trees with massive thorns designed to deter giant ground sloths that no longer exist. Osage orange fruits too large for any living animal to effectively disperse, probably evolved for mammoths or mastodons. Kentucky coffee trees with toxic seeds in pods that nothing alive today wants to eat. The world we inherited from the Ice Age isn't the world that should have emerged. We're living in a diminished version, ecosystems missing their largest members, communities simplified by extinction, a planet still adjusting to losses that happened so recently in geological time that evolution hasn't had time to fill the empty niches. And here's the uncomfortable truth. This was probably the first time humans fundamentally altered the planet's biology. The first great extinction we caused, though certainly not the last. The moment when our species transitioned from just another animal to a geological force capable of reshaping ecosystems on a continental scale. But we didn't know what we were doing. Our ancestors weren't trying to destroy the megafauna. They were just trying to survive, to feed their families, to make it through one more winter. They had no way of understanding that their actions were eliminating species that had survived for millions of years. By the time anyone realized something was wrong, it was already over. The mammoths were gone. The ground sloths were gone. The saber-toothed cats were gone. And the world was different in ways that would echo through every generation that followed, right down to the present day. Picture yourself 13,000 years ago. You're part of a hunter-gatherer band that's been following the same mammoth herds your ancestors tracked for generations. Your people know these animals intimately, their migration patterns, their feeding grounds, where they go to drink, where the females give birth. Your entire world, your entire survival strategy revolves around these massive creatures. Then one spring the mammoths don't come. You wait at the traditional meeting grounds. Nothing. You send scouts to the watering holes. Empty. You travel to the calving areas. Abandoned. Somewhere out there, the herds are dying, maybe already gone, victims of the climate chaos we talked about earlier, and you're left standing in a world that suddenly doesn't make sense anymore. This was the crisis facing human populations across the globe as the Ice Age ended. Not a single crisis, actually, but thousands of them playing out simultaneously in different environments, forcing different solutions, creating the incredible diversity of human cultures that would eventually transform our species from nomadic hunters into farmers, builders, and civilization creators. Because here's the thing about environmental catastrophe. It doesn't just kill, it forces innovation. And humans, especially humans who carried in their DNA the survival instincts of ancestors who'd made it through earlier crises, humans were really, really good at innovating. The archaeological record from 15,000 to 10,000 years ago shows an explosion of adaptive strategies. Not one human response to the changing world, but dozens, maybe hundreds, each tailored to specific local conditions. Some groups doubled down on hunting, developing new weapons and techniques to pursue smaller, faster prey. Others turned to the oceans and rivers, becoming expert fishermen. Still others began experimenting with something that would change everything, deliberately planting seeds. Let's start with the hunters, the traditionalists who refused to give up the lifestyle that had sustained humans for hundreds of thousands of years. As the megafauna died off, these groups had to adapt fast. The massive, slow-moving prey their ancestors had relied on were disappearing, replaced by smaller animals, deer, antelope, wild boar that were faster, more alert, harder to approach. So they developed new technologies. The atlatl, or spear thrower, appeared across multiple continents during this period. It's a simple device, basically a stick with a hook that extends your arm's throwing range, but it increased spear velocity by 60% or more. Suddenly you could kill animals from twice the distance, fast-moving targets that would have been impossible to approach with hand-thrown spears. Even more revolutionary was the bow and arrow, which emerged independently in multiple locations around this time. The bow was a game-changer, literally. Silent, accurate, with a much faster reload time than any throwing weapon. A skilled archer could put 3 arrows in the air before the first one hit. This made hunting small, skittish prey viable in ways it had never been before. But weapons were only part of the adaptation. Hunter-gatherer groups also became more mobile, more opportunistic. Instead of following predictable herds of large animals, they developed what archaeologists call broad-spectrum hunting, pursuing whatever was available in their environment. Archaeological sites from this period show remains of dozens of different animal species, everything from rabbits to birds to turtles. These people were eating anything that moved. Other groups went in the opposite direction. Instead of becoming more mobile, they became more sedentary. And this is where things get really interesting. In the Levant, the region encompassing modern Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, a culture called the Natufians emerged around 12,500 years ago. They were doing something unprecedented in human history, living in permanent settlements while still hunting and gathering. The Natufians weren't farmers yet. They were still getting most of their calories from wild animals and wild plants, but they were staying in one place year-round, building substantial stone houses, creating villages that housed hundreds of people. We found their settlements, complete with stone foundations, storage pits, and elaborate burial sites. Why would hunter-gatherers give up mobility? Because the changing climate had created specific resource-rich zones where they could harvest enough wild food within walking distance to support permanent villages. Wild cereals, wheat, barley, rye, grew so abundantly in certain areas that people could harvest enough grain in a few weeks to feed themselves for months. Add in access to wild game, fish from rivers, and edible plants, and you had environments that could support sedentary populations. But here's where it gets complicated. Those wild cereal stands were productive, but they were also fragile. A drought could wipe them out. So could overgrazing by wild animals. And as Natufian populations grew, concentrated in permanent villages, they were harvesting more and more grain every year, putting pressure on the wild populations. Some researchers think this is what drove the next innovation, deliberate cultivation. Maybe someone noticed that grains grew better in areas where they'd been harvesting. Maybe they started clearing competing plants to give the cereals more space. Maybe they began saving seeds from the best plants to scatter in promising areas. Whatever the mechanism, by 11,000 years ago, the Natufians were definitely cultivating cereals. We can tell because the grain seeds start changing. Wild cereals have brittle stems that shatter when ripe, scattering seeds everywhere. It's a great survival strategy for wild plants, terrible for humans trying to harvest them. But some plants have a genetic mutation that makes their stems tougher. These mutants wouldn't survive in the wild, their seeds would stay stuck to the stems until they rotted. But they were perfect for human harvesters. Natufian sites from this period show increasing percentages of these tough-stemmed mutants. This is the signature of artificial selection. Humans unconsciously breeding plants for traits that made them easier to harvest. They weren't thinking about plant genetics or agriculture as a revolution. They were just saving seeds from plants that were easier to work with and scattering them near their villages. But over generations they were creating domesticated cereals, plants that literally couldn't survive without human intervention. This same process was happening independently in at least 6 other locations around the globe. In China, people were domesticating millet and rice. In Mesoamerica, maize, beans and squash. In the Andes, potatoes and quinoa. In New Guinea, taro and yams. In sub-Saharan Africa, sorghum and yams. In eastern North America, squash and sunflowers. Each region developed its own agricultural complex based on locally available plants, but the pattern was always the same. Environmental pressure, usually from climate change or resource scarcity, pushed populations to intensify their use of certain plants. Intensification led to cultivation. Cultivation led to domestication. And domestication changed everything. But not everyone was farming. While the Natufians and others were experimenting with plant cultivation, huge populations were adapting in entirely different ways. On the coasts, people were developing sophisticated maritime technologies, better boats, improved fishing hooks, nets, traps. Some groups became so skilled at ocean fishing that they abandoned land hunting entirely, living almost exclusively on seafood. The archaeological evidence is stunning. Shell middens, massive piles of discarded mollusk shells, appear on coastlines around the world during this period. Some are dozens of feet deep, representing thousands of years of continuous shellfish harvesting. But they also contain remains of deep-sea fish, evidence of offshore fishing, and bones from seabirds and marine mammals, showing these coastal people were exploiting every available ocean resource, and they had to be skilled. Fishing isn't like hunting. Fish don't have predictable migration routes you can follow. Ocean conditions change constantly. You need to understand tides, currents, seasonal patterns. You need boats that can handle rough water. You need specialized equipment for different prey. You need ways to preserve your catch because fish spoils fast. So coastal populations developed all of it. They created sophisticated fishing calendars, knowing when different species would be most abundant. They invented specialized hooks for different fish, nets for schooling species, harpoons for large animals. They built boats capable of offshore fishing, some using dugout logs, others lashing together reeds or animal skins stretched over wooden frames. Most importantly, they developed preservation techniques, smoking, drying, salting, allowing them to store fish for months. This was crucial because it meant coastal populations could achieve the same kind of food security that agricultural populations were developing, but without farming. Meanwhile, in the Americas, something equally revolutionary was happening. As the ice sheets retreated and sea levels rose, human populations were spreading into every corner of 2 continents. By 13,000 years ago, people had reached the southern tip of South America, an astonishing 10,000-mile journey from the Bering Land Bridge. These migrations happened fast, archaeologically speaking. just a few thousand years for humans to populate 2 entire continents. This wasn't a slow diffusion. This was rapid colonization by highly mobile groups who were constantly pushing into new territories, encountering new environments, adapting on the fly. Some followed the Pacific coast, becoming maritime specialists who island hopped their way south. Others moved through the interior, following ice-free corridors between massive glaciers, hunting the megafauna that still survived in these refuges. Still others probably used both routes, moving back and forth between coast and interior as opportunities presented themselves. Each environment demanded different adaptations. Desert peoples in what become the American Southwest developed sophisticated water management strategies. Coastal groups in the Pacific Northwest became master woodworkers, creating elaborate totem poles and massive plank houses. Plains peoples refined their hunting techniques for bison, developing drive lanes and jump sites that let small groups kill dozens of animals at once. And everywhere, human populations were growing, not just in absolute numbers but in density. Villages that had housed a few dozen people expanded to hundreds. Some locations saw the emergence of what archaeologists call proto-towns, settlements of 1,000 or more people. This created entirely new social challenges. When your band has 30 people, mostly relatives, you don't need complex rules. Everyone knows everyone. Disputes are settled face to face. But when you've got 1,000 people living in close proximity, many of them strangers, you need institutions. Rules about property, conflict resolution, resource distribution. You need leaders, specialists, administrators. The archaeological record shows this emerging complexity. We find evidence of specialized craftspeople making tools or pottery for exchange rather than personal use. We find elaborate burials suggesting status differences. Some individuals buried with rich grave goods while others got simple interments. We find communal structures, buildings too large for single families, probably used for gatherings or rituals. We're watching, in real time through the archaeological record, the foundations of civilization being laid. Not because humans suddenly got smarter or more ambitious, but because environmental pressures forced innovations that made larger, more complex societies possible and then advantageous. By 10,000 years ago, the transformation was well underway. The world had stabilized into something recognizable, seasonal, but not catastrophically so, warm enough for agriculture, but cool enough for comfortable living across most latitudes. And humans had adapted to this new world in 1,000 different ways, each response perfectly tailored to local conditions, each one setting the stage for what would come next. The age of the wandering hunter was ending. The age of the settled farmer was beginning, and nothing would ever be the same. Then, around 11,700 years ago, something extraordinary happened. The climate stopped thrashing around. After millennia of wild swings between glacial cold and warm periods, after the catastrophic floods of Meltwater Pulse 1a, after the Younger Dryas had dragged humanity back to the brink, the Earth's thermostat finally stabilized. Not perfectly, not forever, but enough. Enough to change everything. Geologists mark this moment as the beginning of the Holocene epoch, our epoch, the geological age we're still living in today. But that technical term doesn't capture what it really meant. What it meant was predictability. For the first time in over 100,000 years, you could reasonably expect that next year's climate would look something like this year's. That winter would come at roughly the same time and last roughly the same length. That spring rains would arrive when they were supposed to. That summer heat would be intense, but manageable. That autumn would provide a harvest season worth planning for. This sounds mundane. It's anything but. Because here's the thing about agriculture. You can't invent farming when the climate is chaotic. Planting seeds requires confidence that there will be a growing season. Storing grain for winter requires confidence that winter will actually come. Staying in one place requires confidence that the resources you're depending on won't suddenly vanish because the monsoons failed, or the river dried up, or the temperature dropped 15 degrees in a decade. Our ancestors had been smart enough to develop agriculture for tens of thousands of years. They'd understood the basic principle that you could put seeds in the ground and get food out. But they couldn't commit to it, couldn't build their entire survival strategy around it. Because in an unstable climate, flexibility meant survival. Staying mobile meant you could adapt when everything changed, which it always did. The Holocene changed the equation. For the first time, staying put became safer than moving. Investing in fields and storage facilities and permanent settlements became less risky than following migrating herds. And humanity noticed. Within just 5,000 years of the Holocene's beginning, farming communities had emerged independently on at least 6 continents. Not because of some sudden genetic mutation that made humans smarter, not because one group invented it and everyone else copied, but because the stable Holocene climate opened a window of opportunity that humans everywhere were ready to exploit. In the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, communities began cultivating wheat and barley around 10,000 years ago. They domesticated sheep and goats. They built permanent villages with stone foundations. Within a few generations, these settlements were supporting populations that would have been impossible for hunter-gatherers. Hundreds, then thousands of people living in close proximity, all fed by cultivated fields. In China, different groups were independently developing rice agriculture along the Yangtze River and millet farming in the Yellow River Valley. Same time period, same stable climate window, same revolutionary shift from mobile to sedentary lifestyles. In Mesoamerica, people were domesticating maize, transforming a barely edible wild grass into one of the world's most important crops. This took thousands of years of selective breeding. You could only attempt that kind of long-term agricultural project if you had confidence the climate would remain stable enough to complete it. In the Andes, different communities were cultivating potatoes and quinoa at high altitudes where nothing could have grown during glacial periods. In New Guinea, people were developing sophisticated taro and yam cultivation systems in tropical forests. In Africa, communities along the Sahel were domesticating sorghum and pearl millet. All of this within the first few thousand years of the Holocene, all of it made possible by climate stability. But the Holocene wasn't just stable, it was transformative. The world itself was reshaping into forms we'd recognize today. Forests exploded across the northern hemisphere. The spruce and pine trees that had clung to existence during the Ice Age began marching north, following the retreating glaciers, but they weren't alone. Deciduous trees, oaks and maples and birches that had survived in small southern refuges, spread across the landscape even faster. Within a few thousand years, the tundra and grasslands that had dominated Europe and North America were replaced by dense temperate forests. These weren't just random trees sprouting wherever conditions allowed. These were complex ecosystems assembling themselves. The trees came first, but they brought companions, understory plants that thrived in forest shade, fungi that formed symbiotic relationships with tree roots, insects that pollinated flowers and dispersed seeds, birds and mammals that ate fruits and spread them across the landscape. Each species facilitated others, creating the layered, diverse forest ecosystems that would define the Holocene world. In the tropics, rainforests expanded into territories that had been too dry during glacial periods. The Amazon, which had been fragmented into isolated forest patches separated by grasslands during the Ice Age, reconnected into the vast continuous jungle we know today. This expansion created the most biodiverse terrestrial ecosystem on Earth. Millions of species of plants, insects, birds and mammals, all thriving in the stable wet conditions the Holocene provided. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation happened in the Sahara. Today we think of the Sahara as the quintessential desert, one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. But during the early Holocene, it was anything but. From about 11,000 to 5,500 years ago, the Sahara experienced what scientists call the African humid period. Changes in Earth's orbital parameters shifted the monsoon systems, bringing reliable rainfall deep into what is now desert. And the Sahara bloomed. Enormous lakes appeared where today there's nothing but sand. Lake Chad, which today is a shrunken shadow of its former self, swelled to an area larger than the Caspian Sea. Mega Lake Chad, geologists call it. It was so large it had waves that carved beaches into cliffs that still exist in the middle of the modern desert. There were other lakes too, hundreds of them, some small, some massive, connected by rivers that flowed year-round, fed by monsoon rains and runoff from mountains that actually had snow in the Holocene Sahara. Hard to imagine now, but the evidence is irrefutable. And where there was water, there was life. Grasslands spread across the Sahara, not sparse, struggling grasses, but rich savannas with acacias and palms. Hippos wallowed in Saharan lakes. Crocodiles basked on Saharan riverbanks. Elephants, giraffes and antelopes grazed on Saharan grasslands, and humans followed them in. For over 5,000 years, the Sahara wasn't a barrier but a highway. People moved freely across it, establishing communities around the lakes, herding cattle, creating some of the earliest pastoral societies in human history. The rock art they left behind shows what they saw: swimming hippopotamus, herds of cattle, humans dancing and hunting and living in a landscape that today seems impossible. But around 5,500 years ago, the monsoon shifted again. The rains stopped coming. Within just a few centuries, maybe even faster, the Green Sahara died. Lakes dried up. Rivers stopped flowing. Grasslands turned to scrubland, then to bare desert. The people and animals fled south and north, abandoning a landscape that had supported them for millennia. This wasn't a slow, gentle transition. This was a climate catastrophe that happened in real time, within human memory. Communities that had lived the same way for generations suddenly found their lakes evaporating, their grazing lands dying, their entire world becoming uninhabitable. Some researchers think this sudden desertification of the Sahara might have accelerated the development of complex civilizations along the Nile. As the Sahara dried, populations concentrated along the one major water source that remained. The Nile's annual floods provided reliable water and fertile soil even as the surrounding landscape became desert. This population concentration, this pressure of people competing for limited resources along a narrow river valley, might have been exactly the catalyst needed to transform scattered farming communities into the organized, hierarchical society that became ancient Egypt. Because by this point, around 5,000 years ago, humanity wasn't just farming anymore. We were building civilizations. The stable Holocene climate had done more than just allow agriculture. It had enabled population growth on a scale never before seen. At the end of the Ice Age, there were probably around 5 million humans on Earth. By the beginning of the Holocene, maybe 10 million. But by 5,000 years ago, there were somewhere between 40 and 100 million of us. That's exponential growth. And it was accelerating. More people meant more labour. More labour meant more intensive agriculture. More intensive agriculture meant more food. More food meant more people. It was a feedback loop that transformed human society beyond recognition. Hunter-gatherer bands of 20 to 30 people gave way to farming villages of hundreds. Villages grew into towns of thousands, and then, suddenly, cities. The first cities appeared in Mesopotamia around 5,500 years ago. Uruk, Ur, Eridu, settlements of tens of thousands of people living in close proximity, supported by agricultural surplus from the surrounding countryside. These weren't just big villages. These were fundamentally different kinds of places, requiring new forms of organization. Someone had to coordinate grain storage and distribution. Someone had to organize irrigation projects. Someone had to mediate disputes and maintain order among thousands of people who weren't all related by kinship. So we invented bureaucracy. We created priesthoods and kingships. We developed social hierarchies and specialized occupations. We built walls and temples and palaces, and we invented writing, not for literature or poetry or philosophical treatises. That came later. The first writing systems were invented to track grain stores and tax payments, to record who owed what to whom, to maintain the complex economic relationships that cities required. This happened independently in multiple places: cuneiform in Mesopotamia, hieroglyphics in Egypt, Chinese characters in the Yellow River Valley. Each system different, each invented to solve the same basic problem of managing complexity in stable Holocene societies. And all of it, every bit of this revolutionary transformation from scattered Ice Age survivors to city building, writing inventing, civilization creating humans, all of it happened because the climate stabilized. Because for 11,700 years and counting, the Holocene has provided a Goldilocks climate. Not too hot, not too cold, predictable enough to plan around, stable enough to invest in. We are children of the Holocene. Every city, every book, every piece of technology we've ever created has been developed within this narrow window of climate stability. The entire arc of recorded human history, from the first Sumerian cities to the moon landing, has taken place within a single geological epoch, characterized primarily by its remarkable climate stability, which makes what we're doing now particularly terrifying, because we're ending the Holocene. The carbon we've released, the systems we've destabilized, the feedbacks we've triggered, they're all pushing us out of the climate stability that made civilization possible. We're creating a new geological epoch. Scientists are calling it the Anthropocene, the age of humans. But it might also be the age when humans learn what our Ice Age ancestors knew. That when the climate becomes unpredictable, when the patterns you've depended on suddenly shift, survival requires resilience, adaptation, and a willingness to completely transform how you live. The Holocene gave us 11,700 years of climate stability. We used it well. We built everything. But stability was never permanent. It was always just a window. And now that window is closing. What happens next will determine whether we're as adaptable as our ancestors who survived the end of the last Ice Age, whether we can navigate the end of the Holocene with the same resilience they showed navigating its beginning. The Ice Age taught them survival. The Holocene taught us civilization. What will the Anthropocene teach? That's the question we're living through right now. So here we are. After travelling through 20,000 years of the most dramatic planetary transformation in human memory, we've arrived at the world we know. The world of stable coastlines and predictable seasons. The world of cities and farms and 7 billion people living lives that would seem like impossible magic to our Ice Age ancestors. But here's the thing. Everything we are, everything we've built, everything we think of as normal human civilization, it all exists because of what happened during those chaotic millennia when the ice retreated and the world transformed. Think about it. Every crop we grow descended from wild plants that our ancestors learned to cultivate during the scramble to adapt after the megafauna died out. Every domesticated animal, the product of relationships formed when humans and wolves and wild sheep were all struggling to survive in radically changing landscapes. Every city, built on foundations laid when rising seas and shifting rivers forced people to cluster together in whatever high ground remained safe. Even our stories carry echoes of the Great Thaw, flood myths from every continent, tales of lost lands beneath the waves, legends of giants that once walked the earth. These aren't just fantasies, they're cultural memories of real events, passed down through hundreds of generations, distorted by time but never completely forgotten. The Mesopotamian flood epic, the story of Atlantis, Aboriginal Australian tales of lands swallowed by the sea, they're all remembering the same thing. The drowning of Doggerland and Beringia and Sunderland, the catastrophic floods when ice dams failed, the impossible animals that vanished within living memory of our ancestors. We are who we are because of the Great Thaw, our adaptability, our innovative thinking, our capacity to completely reinvent our way of life when circumstances demand it. These traits were forged during those desperate centuries when nothing was stable, and survival meant constant improvisation. And here's what should really keep us awake at night, or maybe put us to sleep depending on your perspective. We're living in an anomaly. The last 10,000 years, the entire span of human civilization, has been extraordinarily stable compared to what came before. The Holocene has been kind to us. Coastlines staying roughly where they are, climate remaining predictable enough to plan harvests years in advance, ice sheets staying locked away at the poles where they can't drown our cities. But nothing lasts forever. The geological record is clear about that. Earth's natural state is change, sometimes slow, and gradual, sometimes catastrophically fast. Our Ice Age ancestors watched sea levels rise 400 feet in a few thousand years. They experienced temperature swings that would transform landscapes within a single human lifetime. They lived through climate chaos that makes our current concerns look tame by comparison. The difference is there were maybe a few million humans on the planet back then. Now there are 8 billion of us, most living on coastlines that would vanish if the ice sheets decided to melt again, all depending on agricultural systems tuned to the stable climate patterns of the Holocene, all assuming tomorrow will be basically like today. The Great Thaw reminds us that nature doesn't make those kinds of promises. Change is the only constant, and when it comes, it can come faster than we imagine possible. But it also reminds us of something else. Humans are survivors. We've been through worse than anything we're likely to face now. We've adapted to transformations that wiped out species that had ruled the Earth for millions of years. We turned the end of the Ice Age, an event that could have destroyed us, into the beginning of civilization. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, maybe that's the thought to hold on to. Not the catastrophes and the chaos, but the resilience, the stubborn refusal to give up even when the world is drowning around you, the human capacity to look at an impossible situation and figure out a way forward. We're all descendants of the people who lived through the Great Thaw, who watched their world transform and adapted anyway. That DNA is still in us. That capacity for survival, innovation, and hope. If you've enjoyed this journey through deep time, I'd love it if you'd like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from. Maybe you're falling asleep in a place that used to be under ice, or on land that didn't exist until the seas rose and created new coastlines. Sweet dreams. And remember, the world has always been changing. We're just the latest chapter in a story that's been unfolding for millions of years. Rest well.